In literature, one of the sets of themes a narrative can take has to do with man versus something. This can be man versus himself, or man versus man, or a number of other possibilities. One of these that was very popular in the 1990s was the theme of man versus nature. Non-fiction writers/journalists like Sebastian Junger and John Krakauer wrote best-selling works like The Perfect Storm, Into the Wild, and Into Thin Air, telling the stories of human beings trying to survive against the implacable and impersonal forces and energy of a natural world that seemed profoundly hostile. In my personal reading collection at home, I have a shelf dedicated to such narratives, loaded with books bearing the titles God-Forsaken Sea, Demon of the Waters, Isaac's Storm, and Lost on Everest, among others. Of course, such tales are nothing new. The genre, often based in real-life accounts, was hugely popular in the 18 and early 1900s, as various explorers sought to go places no one had gone before, and the stories of their travels, both successful and unsuccessful, were breathlessly printed in newspaper and magazine accounts, and later in the memoirs of those who did survive. Many people, myself included, found and find the tales of struggle compelling, and publishers have been more than willing to feed the hunger for more such stories, as was most recently the case with the 100th anniversary of the Shackleton expedition, centered around the crew of the Endurance and their struggle to survive on the Antarctic ice shelf that ensnared their vessel. In my case, the reason for this fascination has to do with my years as a Boy Scout in the Pacific Northwest. The Scout motto, of course, is be prepared. And one of the things that goes with that is the idea that before one goes out into the wilderness, one should weigh the risks and dangers and take appropriate measures to minimize them and have the necessary tools to increase survival should they arise. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, I began to sort of geek out about what I could do in case something happened on a hike or a campout, what kinds of things I could take, how I could be prepared. What was interesting was that I very quickly realized that if things ever got really bad, well, I might actually not stand much of a chance of survival, even if I did do everything I could to prepare properly. When I got into reading the man versus nature genre of books written in the 90s, I soon recognized that in some of the cases of the genre, the writer got a really important thing wrong. In many of the stories, nature is made out to be some sort of malevolent entity, a thing that wants to kill the protagonist. It's often portrayed as this sort of force of evil, but I think that's just plain wrong. A bit closer to the truth in some versions of the genre portray nature as this sort of impersonal thing that sweeps all things before it. But even this is not quite on the mark. What I realized then, and still believe now to be the most reasonable way to understand these sorts of things, is that nature, at least on the small, personal scale, just doesn't notice human beings. A tornado or hurricane or volcanic lahar doesn't even register its interactions with humans. The energies involved are just way too vast. It's often a matter of scale. We people are just too small and insignificant compared to the vastness and sometimes random nature of natural events. Disasters, we might call them. As an aside and an illustration, I had a student once who, in the course of a class where we were talking about hurricane forecasting and why the model improvements were so important in extending the evacuation times, asked why we didn't just drop a nuclear device into a storm to disrupt it and make it go away. I told him that, aside from the profoundly negative environmental effects such an action would have, the energy released by a nuclear explosion was just insignificant to that contained within a self-generating tropical storm system. He was skeptical of my answer, and so I told him to go and look it up for himself. And when he came back to class a couple of days later, the hurricane, by the way, now much closer to the U.S. coastline, he told me how amazed he was by how much more energy a hurricane had compared to a modern thermonuclear warhead. He had been completely unaware of the scale of natural forces. Just as human beings are insignificant compared to the energy released in fusing a small amount of hydrogen into helium, so too are the most energetic of human weapons when compared to even moderate tropical cyclones. So, to return to our topic of surviving in the wilderness, What I realized as a scout was that while having a good set of tools and knowledge would give me a huge leg up were I to get lost or trapped or in a dangerous situation, what was really going to save me was using my head. In that vein, the first thing I could do was avoid traveling in questionable conditions whenever possible. I could avoid hiking through the mountains on days when thunderstorms were forecast in order not to either get caught out in the open above the tree line in an electrical storm or in a dry wooded area when the lightning sparked a forest fire. I could look at the forecast to see if there was the possibility of excessive rain or snow. Things like that. Second, I could learn some survival skills. I could practice making solid, dry, and warm shelters from natural materials. I could know how to make a fire happen in a number of different ways. I could learn how to travel from point to point on a map and how to read the terrain in order to maximize my chances of getting found if I ended up getting lost or stranded. I realized that being prepared meant that knowing a good set of basic survival skills that would prepare me for most any situation was just as important, if not more so, as having a bunch of equipment for every situation might. Nowadays, I don't get out as much as I used to, but I still find that I use the navigational skills I developed during my scouting days quite a bit. I'm one of those people who tends not to get lost a lot, or when I do get turned around, I can usually reorient myself pretty quickly. It's something that takes some practice, and my background in astronomy helps as well, but I find I can keep pretty good track of direction and distance traveled even without a compass, especially if I do have a watch. That ability, by the way, even got me out of a bit of a jam while driving through western Kansas during a tornado outbreak, but I have to tell you, that's a story for another time. It amazes my wife, who has accused me of wizardry from time to time, and who claims that I might have been tried for witchcraft during the Middle Ages in some places. Something that's probably not too far from the truth given my knowledge of modern physics and chemistry. But again, I digress. When I think of the earliest humans, long before there were permanent settlements and civilizations, I expect that they were pretty amazingly good at this kind of thing too. In fact, I'm really willing to wager that what skills I might have now would be laughably meager in such a society. Hunter-gatherers in all times, from prehistoric tribal peoples to the trappers and fur traders in North America a couple of hundred years ago, had to be pretty good at finding their way and having a mental map of their travels, even if they didn't create some sort of physical artifact to document what they saw in their mind's eye. Once they did start to move towards more permanent habitation, the impulse to make the record more portable and solid would most certainly have been taken from those mental pictures that they had. All of this, of course, created before anything that might have looked like a tool that might allow for something like surveying. So how did they do it? In a world where nature didn't notice them and mistakes could often be fatal, how did they manage to find their way as reliably as they did? How did tribes migrate from hunting ground to hunting ground? How did ancient mariners cross unimaginably vast distances in open boats? How did routes of trade get developed and followed for millennia before there were cities? All of it seems, has to do with sets of navigational skills small groups and cultures of human beings developed that allowed them to see the world around them in manageable terms. Skills that are often collected under the term dead reckoning today. In this episode of the Scientific Odyssey, we're going to spend some time taking a look at some of those techniques and trying to see not only how they worked, but also how they then got translated into knowledge sets that could be used to create some of the earliest physical maps. And in doing so, maybe we can pass along a few tips that might help you find your way around an unfamiliar place using landmarks, both natural and man-made. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 5, Finding Our Way. Episode 3, Dead Reckoning. Getting lost, and I mean really lost, can be a terrifying thing. I'm not talking about that sense of not being able to find your car in the parking lot or getting turned around in some sort of a complex building. In those cases, you can always get a bit of help from someone or come up with a search plan with a bit of thought. What I'm talking about here is really getting lost. What lost persons expert Ken Hill, professor at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia, defines as, quote, "The lost person is unable to identify or orient his present location with respect to known locations, and has no effective means or method for reorienting himself." End quote. Most of us have experience with the first half of that definition, being unable to identify or orient ourselves in a present location. That's the getting turned around thing. What's a lot more serious is when you realize that second condition of Hill's definition is actually met in your circumstance. You have no way of reorienting yourself. That's when you're truly lost. It can happen in a lot of different ways. You're driving and you take a wrong exit off the interstate into an unfamiliar part of a city you don't know much about. Or you're hiking through the woods and a fog layer descends to obscure your view of the surrounding countryside. Maybe you're on a large body of water away from shore and the clouds move in and hide the sun. All of a sudden, everything looks really strange and yet somehow familiar. I can remember a time when trying to navigate through Oklahoma City on one of the long east-west running boulevards where I felt like my wife and I kept passing the same set of stores on corner after corner every couple of blocks. Everything looked the same all of a sudden, and yet I had no idea where I was. Eventually, my wife and I began noting the names of the churches that we passed so that we could be sure that we weren't driving around in circles somehow at close to midnight in an area of town where everything had all closed up at 10 p.m. Oftentimes, the response to such a situation is that we usually begin to search for clues, anything we can grasp onto that might help us to establish our sense of location. We have sort of an idea of what things should look like, given either a physical or mental map that we have, and then what we might do is all of a sudden we realize that there's not a lot of correspondence between that map and what we're actually seeing. So we try to reestablish that correspondence by looking for clues, or as mapping experts will sometimes call them, cues. Sometimes this works, but if we're really truly lost, it usually doesn't, and what results actually only makes things worse. The reason for this is that we begin to try to force things that don't actually correspond to anything in our picture of how the world is supposed to be to do so. This results in a mental process known as quote-unquote bending the map, where we try to force features we see to line up with what our map, whatever it might be, says we should be seeing. As you might imagine, there's a lot of confirmational bias that goes on in this process where we pay attention to the things that confirm our sense of being on the right track and we ignore those clues that don't fit. This often leads a person who is lost to become even more lost. In other words, maybe you're only a little bit of lost to begin with, but as you try to do this map bending, you travel further and further afield from your intended path. In the case of my drive through the suburbs of Oklahoma City, I kept seeing landmarks that had been given to me in the directions from a friend that were, in fact, very different things. It was only when I finally found a working payphone and called her that I learned that I had gone miles past the turn I was supposed to have taken. When you read the stories of adventures gone awry, you see this theme of bending the map show up over and over and over again. Very often, when people who are rescued from being lost are interviewed afterwards, they will tell of a slowly creeping panic that first manifested itself as confusion and map bending, and then at some point became almost overwhelming in its all-consuming nature. As the person realized that they were good and truly lost, the fight or flight response was activated, and the adrenaline that was dumped into their blood system short-circuited rational thought. Often they reported dropping vital and important gear to run in the direction of what they thought was the way back to something that resembled not being lost. And this action usually only made the situation that much worse. It's in these situations that the value of having good habits of mind that are able to recall training and advice can be the difference between life and death. One of my great fears in Scouts was that I would become lost in the woods on a hike with my troop. On my cycling adventures now, especially in an unfamiliar place, it's one thing that I still have to deal with from time to time. For example, some time ago I did a 200-mile ride from my home in central Georgia to my in-laws in lower Alabama. And this took place before there were small, inexpensive GPS units that sort of guide you around. My biggest worry was not that I would be unable to physically complete the ride, but that I would get lost or lose my way, as I had only incomplete hand-drawn maps, the route numbers of the state highways I would ride along during some portions of my route, and my memory of what better maps looked like. I had to hope that the smaller county back roads would be well enough surfaced, or that I'd be able to find my way around any obstacles such as sandy or gravel-covered roads, washed-out bridges, or other impediments. The possibility of getting stranded out on a lonely back road in South Georgia in nothing but spandex and lycra was something that, as you might imagine, really concerned me. But what I also knew was that I had learned the various skills and mindsets that would allow me to chart my way through what was, for me, uncharted territory. Skills that I ended up putting to use on a couple of occasions on that long ride. It was the ability to find my way and to know the space I was traveling through that kept me from panicking when things didn't line up to my expectations as I found myself off course. In those short intervals of time, I was able to do what mariners call dead reckoning, something that for most of humanity's existence was the only way to navigate the wild. Think about it for a minute. Imagine being a member of a tribe that traveled across one of the great, vast, mostly flat plains or prairies or savannas that are found on nearly every continent. Maybe you're a Native American of one of the Sioux tribes, or a Mongol horse messenger, or an African hunter, and before you is a sea of low to medium grass that stretches out around you for miles. Perhaps instead you're an Arabian trader with a caravan that's crossing the edge of the Sahara. Or, most amazingly, maybe you're a Polynesian ship navigator crossing the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean with the intention of reaching the tiniest dots of land somewhere off in the distance. How do you even do that? How did they do that? How did they not get lost and die? Well, first off, to be honest, I'm guessing that some of them did. Those who were young and careless, overestimating their ability and underestimating the risk. Those who were unlucky enough to be in the wilderness when nature inexorably moved through and ended them with no notice or trace. Those who allowed panic and fear to overrule their training and knowledge and lead them to disaster. Every culture has stories of those who just disappeared with no trace or explanation, developed to teach the young that traveling through the world isn't something to be trifled with, and wandering off from one's tribe is usually a really, really bad idea. But what's amazing is that we know that there were many who did make the trips, and who did survive to become old hands with years of experience and knowledge. What I'd like to do in this episode of the podcast is to share descriptions of some of their methods so that you can get a sense of how they began to develop their earliest mental maps, pictures that would become the physical maps that would eventually be created and passed down and along to others. Now, as we start out, let me be clear about one thing. The information presented here is not intended to be instructional in any way. There's not nearly enough time in a roughly 1 hour long podcast episode to even begin to train the skills and habits of mind needed to dead reckon or orienteer effectively. Rather, this presentation is intended to give you a sense of how those who did have those skills might have done it and then use the knowledge they developed to begin to create maps. If you find yourself lost in some situation, the best thing you can do is to stop moving once you've reached a relatively safe place. Take an accounting of your situation and what it is in terms of your physical condition and what you have with you, and to let any sense of panic pass. Only then should you consider what the next steps are, and if you don't have a lot of navigational or survival skills, stay in place, work to develop protective shelter that will help you stay warm in the elements, and if possible, see if there's a way to reach out to those who may be looking for you. If you are interested in developing these sorts of skills, I would suggest that you reach out to your local civic organizations, such as whatever scouting programs might exist in your area, local law enforcement organizations, or rescue groups like the Civil Air Patrol or recovery operations such as the Red Cross or Red Crescent. While these groups may not have programs that will provide the necessary training, there's a good chance that they or someone in them will know where such programs can be found. For those of you listening who may have an interest in field activities in the areas of geology, botany, or even astronomy, I would recommend making some time to at least learn the basics in order to avoid the obvious pitfalls while you're out in the wild doing your science thing. Okay. To dead reckon, you need to be able to determine two things: distance and direction. This may seem pretty obvious, but it turns out that developing the skills to gauge the two can actually be a lot harder than you think. One of the things research about the behavior of people who get lost has shown is that when folks who are lost try to walk their way out of a situation, they actually aren't very good at walking in a straight line, especially if the horizon is either obscured or featureless. Turns out that most of us walk in right-bearing circles, according to Jan Solman and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Tübingen, Germany, who performed experiments in large, flat, wooded areas where the sun was obscured by fog or clouds. Similarly, the International Search and Rescue Incident Database has developed a number of mathematical models from data gathered from thousands of search and rescue operations, and what they find is that lost persons generally travel using a random walk or, a stochastic, to use the fancy term, sort of a pathway. In other words, just trying to walk back to wherever you started usually results in going nowhere fast. The reasons for this behavior, this inability to walk in a straight line for any length of time in the absence of external visual cues, is debated. Some data suggest that it may be due to uneven leg lengths or stride preferences based on handedness, but the more commonly accepted idea is that the almost random data input in the form of things like surrounding trees or undergrowth or wave patterns on water may create a sort of noise in the parts of the brain that govern the intuitive process of dead reckoning, sort of short-circuiting the ability to truly determine direction and distance. In addition, there are usually factors that may bias the random walk or loopy path. Things such as a slope, we tend to walk downhill, even if we don't mean to, or poor folkwisms such as follow water. In these cases, if there is no way to establish direction in a consistent manner, your best plan of action is to conserve energy and resources by staying put. Such cases, however, are usually actually pretty rare, with, of course, the notable exception, such as when one is at sea. There are usually, many ways to establish direction if one is familiar, at least to a degree, with the area and has some experience in looking for them. The easiest and most obvious of these is something we've talked about in our third season shows, and that is to use sky marks such as the position of the North Star or the rising and setting points of the sun. Combine the latter of these with a gnomon or an upright stick, and one can generally get a good sense of a north-south line using shadow lengths. These methods, however, can take a day or two to establish and may be a bit clunky when traveling depending on the terrain. Another means, one used by Inuit and other Native American peoples when traveling, is to use wind direction. When I lived in Kansas, one of the things I learned after about a year of being there was that the wind either blew from the northwest or from the south. In fact, it was so consistent that it shaped the trees into very specific sort of what we call leeward patterns. This wind was fairly seasonal, with the flow of air out of Nebraska dominating, especially in the months of late winter and early spring. That wind was always cooler, dare I say colder, and wetter than the hotter, drier air that moved in from Oklahoma to the south. Had I gotten lost out on the prairie, I'm pretty sure that even if I were unable to see the sun, I could have established an approximate north-south line based on placing that raw, wet wind on my left cheek, or, less frequently, the warm south wind to my face. In a modern urban environment, one can keep track of direction actually using TV satellite dishes. The way this works is that if you're in a particular location, say a city, all the dishes installed for a particular provider have to point at that provider's geosynchronous satellite in order to receive their signal. While this direction will be different for different places depending on their latitude and longitude on the Earth, dish antennas for an area a few tens or even hundreds of miles across should be roughly constant and thus can be used to indicate travel in a specific direction. One must exercise some caution using this method, however. In some places there may be more than one satellite TV provider, and thus different satellites would be used to acquire signal. This means that the dishes from each different provider will likely point in different directions. If you plan to navigate by satellite dish, be sure to make note of which provider you're using and stick with it. And note, not every city or not every region uses the same providers. Along these same lines, there are a number of old wives' tales or folklore stories related to determining direction that have to be held at arm's length if they are to be used at all. One such direction-finding saying is that of moss only growing on the north side of trees. Now, there is some basis for this piece of folklore. If you happen to live in the northern hemisphere, in the temperate zone, roughly between 30 and 65 degrees latitude, the path of the sun from east to west swings through the southern sky, as we previously noted. This means that if the trees are in an environment where they're spaced out enough to get good sunlight, the southern bark of the trees will tend to dry out well from the morning dew, and so the moss won't have sufficient moisture to grow there. Conversely, since the sunlight will not reach the north-facing bark of the tree, it will remain damp, and so the combination of nutrient-rich bark and water will act as an excellent site for the parasitic growth of moss. The problem with this piece of folklore is that you kind of have to have just the right kind of forest for it to work. Not every tree, or at least every species of tree, will support moss growth. But more importantly, the density of trees has to be such that the area stays moist enough to support growth, but not so dense that sunlight is blocked from hitting the south side of the trees. Additionally, there are other terrain-based conditions, such as the trees growing on a slope or in certain types of soils, that can change how and where the moss grows. Finally, it is surprisingly easy to mistake certain species of lichens for moss if you haven't familiarized yourself with the differences. And while it is true that there are some species of lichens that grow in very similar condition to mosses, there are others that can do with much less moisture and thereby can be found on tree bark on sides facing other directions. In short, if you have the requisite knowledge of the types of trees and the environmental conditions that will lead to preferential moss growth, as this all might be called, and are able to definitively identify which organisms might be growing on tree bark, the use of moss can provide a rough directional indicator, but it's certainly not the surefire method for locating north that it's sometimes presented to be. The origin of this particular bit of folklore, by the way, seems to be with the Native American tribes in what is now North Carolina. The earliest reports date to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Probably the best source for these were the various accounts of John Lawson, who served as the British Surveyor General for the region. He wrote a number of works, most notably A New Voyage to Carolina, wherein he described his interactions with the local native peoples, most especially the Tuscarora tribe in the coastal areas of the colony. In this work he writes, quote, "They are expert travelers, and though they have not the use of our artificial compass, yet they understand the north point exactly, let them be in never so great a wilderness. One guide is a short moss that grows on some trees, especially on the north side thereof." End quote. A bit later on, Robert Walsh wrote in a paper that he submitted to the American Quarterly in 1837, quote, It may not be irrelative to observe in this place that it is to the presence of fungus or moss on the north side of trees that travelers and Indians direct their course through unfrequented forests. End quote. Perhaps the most culturally influential of these sorts of writings came from Anglican missionaries. Fervently anti-slavery in their views of the American economic system, these men and women wrote a number of tracts explaining how slaves, or those who might wish to help them, might flee their condition in the American South using the Underground Railroad. In one such pamphlet, the prose explains, quote, "Almost all plantation slaves know the North Star. Like the Indians, are particularly observant of nature. The various changes of the weather, their habits and wants compel them to notice objects that may be of use to them, which pass unobserved by others. Thus the Indian can travel the pathless forest without compass, and when the North Star cannot be seen, he can find his way by observing the moss on the trees, which is always on the north side. The slave whose heart, like the needle of the compass, always points to liberty at the north, learns the pole star and takes it for his guide." End quote. In another such pamphlet comes the account, quote, "The abolitionists in the slave states, for there are many, though they cannot advocate their principles, very kindly give the slaves information as to the direction of Canada and the free states through which they must pass to reach it. Also the names of the most important rivers, all of which information the slaves remember. With this instruction alone, the slave starts for Canada. The North Star is his guide. By it he knows his course. When the clouds intervene and thus obscure the flickering light of this beautiful star, nature has a substitute. A smooth, soft substance called moss, which grows on the barks of the trees, is thicker on the north side of the tree, and thus serves as a guide northward, till the heavenly guide again appears." End quote. By the time of Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, with its renewed interest in the outdoors and conservation, such folklore moved from accounts of native practice to advice given to aspiring outdoorsmen. This can be seen in the writings of people such as Horace Kephart, a prolific author on the subject of outdoor skills. In one article in the popular Outing magazine, published in 1903, entitled "How to Tell Direction in Forest and on Prairie," he writes, quote, "It is a common saying of woodsmen that moss grows thickest on the north side of a tree. This rule is fairly reliable in flat timbered country, in northern latitudes, but not in mountainous regions, nor in swamps, nor in the damp forests of the south. Moss grows best where there is continuous moisture. It is intolerant of sunlight. Where the land is fairly level, but not swampy nor subject to overflow, and the winds do not differ materially in dampness, the moss grows thickest on the north or shady side of the tree, and the south side is graced with the largest and longest limbs." End quote. This advice would be repeated often in the pages of Outing, Forest and Stream, and Boy's Life throughout the early 20th century, until the U.S. Army did a statistical study during World War I to determine if this was, in fact, good advice to give its soldiers navigating through the forests of France and Belgium. The results of this study found that such claims were often overstated, and that the advice was an unreliable guide. As you might imagine, this sparked off a bit of a debate, which led to more data gathering. Over the course of the next 60 years, evidence in support of the Army's findings continued to accumulate until by the 1960s, the Boy Scout Handbook and Associated Boys' Life magazine stated unequivocally that the practice was too unreliable to count on. Ironically, though, just as this was happening, there was another cultural phenomenon taking place that helped keep the folklore alive and well known. In 1943, the biographer Earl Conrad published a gripping account of the life of Harriet Tubman. Tubman had fled slavery from Maryland to Philadelphia in 1849 and had later become a well-known conductor on the Underground Railroad. In Conrad's account of her work in that role, he brought back the accounts from those old Anglican missionary pamphlets, writing, quote, "In addition to the fundamental requisites of travel on the road, such as arming with a pistol or other firearm, and the possession of funds and a knowledge of routes to the north, there were countless tricks of travel, and Harriet was acquainted with most of them. The most elementary knowledge, of course, was to be able to recognize the North Star, for all travel was done at night, and this star was the main reliance. Most conductors knew the trick of looking for moss on the north side of trees, and by this being able to determine a northerly direction." End quote. So powerful was Conrad's writing that by the 1970s, even though his description was made generally for all conductors on the Underground Railroad, author Judith Nyes would claim that the skill was directly attributable to Tubman. In 9 Women, Portraits from the American Radical Tradition, she says, quote, "She," meaning Tubman, "had only 2 means of determining her way: following the North Star when the weather was clear, feeling the moss which grew on the north side of tree trunks when it was cloudy." End quote. To be clear, we don't know if Tubman used the method as a navigational aid. She may very well have, as we know that people who work the land often develop the skills to discern from it the subtle details that escape the attention of those less tied to it. What's interesting here, at least to me, is that even as scientifically gathered evidence was accumulating to put lie to the development of a general rule in one area of interest, i.e. outdoorsmanship, powerful cultural narratives in other areas, in this case women's studies, were sustaining said folklore. I think it's a wonderful example of just how complex these things can be, and it may provide insight as to why some anti-scientific ideas and movements persist in the face of good evidence to the contrary. To quote from the Abrahamic scriptural tradition here, "Let he who has ears hear." Now that we've talked a bit about direction, let's look at distance, the other component for dead reckoning. There are a couple of ways to think about distance and its measurement. One has to do with trying to approximate your distance from something, and another has to do with how far you've traveled while moving. In the first case, the best way to do this is to compare known sizes for an object to its perceived size. In other words, if you know how tall, say, a church steeple or a telephone pole is, you can get a pretty good sense of how far away you are from it by measuring how tall it looks from where you are. The smaller it is, of course, the further away you happen to be standing from the object. A great way to visualize this is to think of standing at the side of a long, fairly straight road that has power or telephone lines strung down it along poles. As you look at the poles as they recede off into the distance, their apparent height gets smaller and smaller. Another way of saying this is that the visual angle they take up decreases. The reason this second way of looking at the phenomenon is useful is that we all have a somewhat accurate set of angle measuring tools that we carry around with us. As we've mentioned back in the early part of the Finding Our Place series, you can use your hands and fingers as a pretty reliable way to measure angles, especially near the horizon. A finger is about 1.5 degrees when the wrist is bent at a right angle to the forearm. 3 fingers is about 5 degrees when held the same way. Your hand with the thumb extended is somewhere around 15 degrees. Now, to measure distance using a visual angle really accurately requires a bit of math, specifically trigonometry, but it turns out that there are some rules of thumb, pun intended, that can be developed heuristically. An object with a height of 100 feet, or about 30 meters, observed from a distance of 1 mile will make an angle of about 1 degree. From 1 kilometer, it'll be about 1.5 degrees, or a finger width. Proportionally, that same 100-foot tall object, when viewed from 1/10 of a mile, will take up 10 degrees, or about the width of your closed fist from the top knuckle to the bottom knuckle. With a little practice and some knowledge of urban construction, you can get pretty good at estimating distances to objects near where you are. Water towers are generally built to be about 165 feet, or about 50 meters tall. Church steeples can vary, but for a typical country church, they're usually between 50 and 100 feet. For urban churches, 100 to 200 feet. A typical building will be about 10 feet per story, though some older houses and most public buildings will be closer to 15 feet per story. By counting the rows of windows, you can get a sense of the actual height of the building in the distance. A standard wooden utility pole will be about 10 meters or 35 feet in height, though they can be taller if made from a material such as steel or concrete in order to hold high voltage power lines. Cell towers usually run about 200 feet, while a wind turbine will be about 330 feet or 100 meters above the ground. If you're out in the countryside with few of these artifacts of modern life, things can get a bit trickier. Here you probably want to use trees to do your estimation, but to do that what you need to do is select the tallest trees you can see, as these are likely to be more standardized in their height for a given species. Pine trees are typically able to grow to about 100 feet, though some varieties can reach 150. Similar heights can be obtained by old-growth oak and elm trees. A good rule of thumb is to pick out the tallest trees you can see and estimate a height of about 100 feet, and then apply the rule of thumb we discussed. Another way to estimate distances can be to use what features can be distinguished in various objects. Author Harold Gatty, who wrote a number of works on navigation, generally has created a list of some of these distinguishing characteristics and the distances that are associated with them. At 50 yards, the mouth and eyes of a human being can be distinguished. At about 100 yards, he says, those look like dots. At about 300 yards, you can make out faces. At 500 yards, arms and legs. At a half a mile, a person, he says, looks more or less just like a post. At a mile, trunks of large trees can be seen. 2 miles, chimneys and windows can be distinguished. 5 miles, you can recognize various types of large structures. And at 10 miles, you can see very tall structures and can recognize what they are, i.e. it's a water tower, a church steeple, what have you. Now, there are a number of other authors, including John Huth, who have found these distance estimates to be a bit over-optimistic and suggest they should be reduced by about a third. Additionally, Gatty's numbers assume the objects are well lit from the front by a strong light source like the sun. Rear lighting or poor light conditions will render details indistinguishable at the distance listed, though in some cases silhouetting may make things stand out on a horizon in a more pronounced way. I certainly know that I've used this method quite frequently on my bike riding, especially when I'm out in the country and I'm hoping to make my way to a small town where I can find a convenience store to refill my water bottles. One of the things that I always look for is the water tower, and by looking at when and where I find it, I can usually estimate to a pretty reliable distance how far away I am. Now, one last way you might be able to estimate distance visually is when a visual cue is accompanied by a loud sound, such as would be the case for a lightning strike. Light, due to its incredible speed, will travel almost instantaneously from an event to an observer. Sound, on the other hand, travels much more slowly, only about 1,100 feet or 340 meters per second. Hence, counting the number of seconds from a lightning flash to when the thunder reaches you gives a distance of about 0.2 miles for each second. By the way, if you, like me, were ever told by a parent or caregiver that the lightning was a mile away for each second, you were misled, possibly in an attempt to lessen your fear that such a violent event could happen so close to you. If you're out in the open and you hear thunder within 5 seconds of a lightning strike, that means that the electrical discharge happened within 1 mile of your location, and you should definitely seek cover as soon as possible. While atmospheric conditions can have a lot of effect on this, it is possible to hear thunder from as far away as 25 miles, which would mean the strike happened about 2 minutes earlier. Another method to estimate distance is to use the old distance equals rate times time formula that you probably learned in middle school or junior high or something like that to come up with the distance traveled. To use this, of course, one has to know their speed, and that can be a bit tricky. But again, there are a few rules of thumb that can help you out if you don't have some sort of technology like a GPS unit or a speedometer that tells you. The best of these is that a walking person, a rowed or paddled boat, and a simple sailboat will all move at a speed of about 3 miles an hour in typical smooth conditions. Therefore, if you can keep track of the time, you can come up with a distance. The imperial unit known as a league is basically this measurement, the amount or distance a walking man can travel in an hour. So, when you think of a league, well, a league is about 3 miles. In Arabic, a marhala is 8 farsakhs, or about 25 miles, the distance a person can walk in 8 hours. Other similar terms from human practice have similarly evolved. A furlong is literally a long furrow and is the typical distance an oxen can pull a heavy plow before becoming fatigued and needing to rest. When the imperial units were standardized in Britain and then spread throughout its empire during the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, a furlong was made to be an even eighth division of a mile at 220 yards. The old Greek stadia is believed to be about the same distance at 125 paces. Getting back to finding distance from speed, keeping track of the time can be done using the sun and the angle measurements you make by your hand by knowing that the sky turns 15 degrees in an hour, and so the sun will move across the sky that same angular distance in that given amount of time, i.e. 1 hour. Measuring this can be tricky when the sun is high in the sky, but having a good sense of the north-south line will help, and so will some practice. I can tell you that I often use the sun angular distance from the horizon or horizontal along its path as a way to determine about how much longer I have to ride when I'm out on my bike. Since I know that I can ride about 20 miles an hour, that means I travel 1 mile every 3 minutes or 5 miles for every length of my outstretched fist with the thumb extended, and yes, I have been known to measure the sun's angle this way while riding. Given that I can add another 15 or so minutes after sunset for there to be enough light to still ride safely and be visible to motorists, this helps me determine if I need to be thinking of a shorter route to get home. On more than one occasion, I changed my ride plans because of this, or because of doing this, and saved myself the harrowing experience of having to ride in low light conditions. The key thing to doing this is to have a good sense of the sun's path from its position where you're observing it to where it will actually set on the horizon, and that's something that changes with the season. So here again, a little astronomical knowledge can go a long way in helping out. A final method of measuring distance is one that's been used since ancient time, and that's to just count your steps. The term mile in English actually comes from the Latin millipacem, or 1,000 paces. For most people, a pace, or 2 steps, one with the left and then one with the right foot, is between 5 and 5.5 feet and averages to be about 5,250 feet when done 1,000 times. This, by the way, is what many of your step counting apps on the phones do. They measure the acceleration of the phone using the built-in accelerometer and look for the characteristic of pattern associated with walking. Once they sort of detect that, they're able to count the steps and then get your distance from that count. In the better apps, they actually even have a bit of machine learning that allows them to couple the GPS data that they're taking with the accelerometer data they're taking in order to come up with more accurate measurements and estimates based on your particular stride. It's really quite an amazing thing, and just another example of how the modern cell phone is packed with a number of sensors that allow you to do some really cool scientific and navigational tasks. So finally, we come to putting these two things, direction and distance, together in order to dead reckon. In modern terminology, there are a few common terms, such as point of destination, where you're traveling to, heading, the direction of travel, bearing, the direction from an observer to a point of interest, and fix, the determinative location that is well known, that are used in talking about dead reckoning, when associated especially with using those skills to understand or read a map. When dead reckoning, it's important also to understand that as time passes, the uncertainty in terms of location will grow until that location is fixed through some sort of unambiguous observation or measurement. The hardest thing about dead reckoning, as we've mentioned, is to maintain a constant direction, especially when walking over uneven terrain or lacking good visual cues. As we've mentioned before, the tendency is to walk in circles or in just random paths. To avoid this, good navigators develop tools to allow them to avoid this pitfall. One way to do this is to use a prominent nearby landmark and then a more distant landmark to establish a line of travel. This is a bit like using a set of gun sights. For example, one might pick a particularly tall or notable tree a few miles off that is lined up with an even more distant hill or mountain peak. One then walks so that the two remain lined up until one approaches the tree. At that point, a new nearby object is selected that is in line with the tree in the mountaintop, and the journey is continued. In featureless environments, such as deserts or prairies, one can use the method of caravanning to stay traveling in a straight line. In the Middle Ages, Arabic and North African traders would usually travel in long trains across the desert. While this was in part for security from raiders, as there is strength in numbers, it also served a navigational purpose. Once a direction of travel was determined, usually using the rising sun in the morning, the caravan would set out in a long straight line. One person at the rear of the line would be tasked with making sure that the front of the line didn't veer either to the right or left by communicating instructions up the caravan. Similar methods were used by early wagon trains crossing the North American plains and fleets of ships sailing the Atlantic. Speaking of ships, with sailing vessels of larger sizes employing better and more efficient sails, speeds of greater than 3 miles an hour can easily be attained with sufficient wind. As such, it was necessary to find ways to estimate these speeds in some sort of an accurate fashion. One of the most common ways was to throw something overboard at the front of the vessel and then time how long it took for the ship to travel past that thing. Knowing the length of the ship would allow the navigator to calculate the speed, at least with respect to any current the ship might be traveling through, as would be the case in rivers or along ocean gyres such as the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic. In time, ship's navigators developed a method of tying a rope to a buoyant object such as a log that could be then hauled back in for repeated use. Observations of the timing of the ship's movement with respect to the log and the calculation of speed that came from that data would be kept as part of the Navigators Journal, which soon became known as a logbook, a term that would spread to be used in reference to any official account of the operation of the vessel, such as a captain's log. One final bit of terminological trivia can be found in that in time, it was found that it was easier to determine the speed by throwing the log overboard and then using an hourglass to measure a set amount of time that would pass. Once this was done, the rope's outplay would be stopped and measured to determine the ship's speed. To make this process easier, British sailors would tie knots at specified regular intervals in the rope, and these would be then counted as they passed over the edge of the deck. In time, a ship's speed would come to be reported in knots, and these were eventually correlated to a nautical mile, which is the amount of latitude distance on the Earth's globe covered by an angular arc of 1/60th of a degree, also known as 1 arc minute. This corresponds to 1.1 statute miles as the regular imperial unit is known. And, this is the sort of thing that you use or hear about in applications when movement is correlated with latitude and longitude, usually with vessels at sea or with aircraft. An important skill with determining and maintaining direction is to develop a number of cross-checks. If one intends to travel east, a fix on true north can be made using the North Star. This can then be checked against the rising position of the sun, which can be used to confirm approximate dates. This can be used to establish a bearing or heading line using visual landmarks. As travel takes place, paces or paddle strokes can be counted to give a sense of distance and determine the passage of time, which can be checked against the changing position of the sun in the sky. Add to this an awareness of wind direction or wave motion, and you've actually got a pretty good way of keeping track of one's movement through space using a number of cross-correlated pieces of data that will arrive at a surprisingly accurate answer. In some research, what can be shown is that with all of these different methods, the various random errors that show up actually tend to cancel out, and you can certainly be accurate to within 10%, and sometimes much more accurate than that. What all of this is supposed to do is develop a real sense of spatial awareness of what you're traveling through. Here, if you've taken some time to study a map of the region well, then the dead reckoning skills will help you to establish your position on the map or reestablish a location if you've kind of lost that. If you don't actually have a map or some sort of map knowledge, the process of dead reckoning will work with a number of other internal processes to help you develop that sense of what the space you're in is actually like if you're careful and deliberate in your work. You can make progress in a direction, and that's really can be very helpful. As with most things, practicing these skills in environments you know and are familiar with will hone them for use in situations where you're a lot less familiar. And this brings us to our final connecting point. As early hunter-gatherers or horsemen scouted lands or pathways, they would do so with an intention of creating a mental picture of the landscape they inhabited or traveled through. In this sort of activity, scouts would likely have headed out in different directions, making good notes of how far they traveled and in what directions, so that they could return with information to share with the larger tribal group. This might include time traveled or in direction to an obvious landmark, such as a large rock outcropping or a major body of water, such as a lake or river. This would be noted, discussed, and cataloged, and then the tribe would decide on which routes to take next. Before long, this information would begin to be ritualized in song or dance, as well as in artistic renderings, such as cave paintings or rock wall carvings. From there, it's just not a very big jump to smaller and more portable artifacts. In other words, maps. Now, to be clear, this wasn't necessarily the fastest process in the world, and it didn't produce completely accurate maps. Scouts would be lost over time to various mishaps and maladies of both natural and human origin. Accurate scales would be difficult to establish due to changes in terrain or the existence of obstacles. Distances and times could be conflated in ways that were non-standard, such as 3 days' travel down a river would change depending on what the river current was at any given time. Ancient maps that have been found show that this sort of distortion happens pretty frequently. However, what is clear is that over time, a pretty good consensus of a mental map of a route or region would develop in a group, something demonstrated when anthropologists asked a group of Inuit tribal hunters to draw a map of the island they lived on. While such an activity was rarely, if ever, done among the life of the tribe, different individuals produced surprisingly consistent maps of the island that were actually fairly close to that produced by modern geographical survey methods. While certain features, such as bays and jetties, would be distorted, the physical maps created from the tribal memory could be said to be functionally accurate, especially given the fact that the island lacked much in the way of highlands or elevation points that would have allowed a more top-down or map-like view. Depending on how long a tribe or group had been in the area, the spatial or map knowledge they created could have been limited to route knowledge that we discussed in the last episode, or, if given enough time, developed into survey knowledge. This process would have been aided by the creation of markers or monuments along important routes, as would be done as tribes settled into more or less permanent or semi-permanent habitation. The Roman Empire's use of mile markers along their roads may well have developed from the practice of piling up stones along well-traveled footpaths. This is a method still used today to mark trails in remote areas where getting lost is a real possibility. One of the things that every Boy Scout who does hiking learns is how to look for and leave trail markers that tell where the trail is and where it is going. The Hebrew Scriptures are full of stories where one figure or another erects a monument to a monumentous event or a theophanal encounter. While these do memorialize the occurrences that are mentioned, they also serve as route markers for others who pass that way. The stories, likewise, teach the young how to find the route between various far-flung sites of a semi-nomadic people. This, finally, brings us full circle in our episode. In his book, The Lost Art of Finding Our Way, John Huth tells of a Persian proverb that goes something like, "Fortune is infatuated with the efficient." Well, this can be understood in several different contexts. When it comes to the process of wayfinding, with or without a map, it speaks to having the right mix of skills and tools to maximize the chance of success and, in some cases, survival. Good luck usually doesn't just happen. It's the result of rigging the odds in your favor. As I said at the outset of the episode, when you go out into the world, you can't bring enough stuff to be prepared for everything. There are just too many possibilities. However, with a smallish number of the right tools and a good set of precautionary practices and navigational skills, you can reduce the chances of getting lost and do a lot to get out of a jam if you ever get into one. The number one thing, of course, is that you don't just go off into the wild alone and without anyone else knowing about your trip. Use the buddy system. Take a partner when you go out if at all possible, and whatever the case, be sure to let someone at home know where you're going and when you'll be back. If possible, set check-in times and arrange a deadline time that you'll contact them upon your return, or they will begin attempts to contact or locate you. Set a limit on how long they'll wait to hear from you before contacting the local authorities. Tell them the region you plan on going to and the route you intend to take. Heading into the great wild unknown with no plan, Jack Kerouac style, may be romantic, but it's also a good way to get yourself killed. The second thing is to always remember that for the most part, nature isn't going to even notice you. It's not for you, it's not against you, it's not an impersonal force that sweeps all before it. It just doesn't notice you. As such, it's your job to make sure that you respect that reality and make decisions that are in accordance with it. Walking up to a ledge to get a better view might seem like a cool thing, but if that outcropping is made of rotten stone, gravity is, as my PhD advisor who was a balloonist would often say, a pathological beast, and the forest you're in won't really notice one more rock slide. Third, the best things you can bring along with you can be categorized into two sort of groups. One group are things that will help you meet the basic needs of nutrition, shelter, and warmth. You can do an amazing amount with some good rope or twine, a supply of waterproof matches, and a solid multi-tool pocket knife. Add to that a sturdy, lightweight tarp made of high-vis material and a couple of days' supply of high caloric density food, and you've given yourself a much better chance of survival if you do get lost. The second set of tools has to do with navigation and things that will help a search and rescue party locate you if they get called in. Bring a compass and a map of the region you'll be traveling through. Make sure your cell phone has a full charge and that you also have at least a single charge backup. Be sure to turn off the Wi-Fi feature so that your phone won't use power searching for a signal there. And if you realize you're lost, turn your phone off completely so you can save power for when you need it to message. Additionally, take some high-vis tape, such as crime scene tape and a marker. If you do get lost, you can use pieces of tape to mark your path, making notes on the tape as to the time it was placed. Throw in a small signaling mirror as well, as it doesn't add much weight and can be useful in letting a search and rescue plane know your location. Finally, some sort of first aid kit is usually a pretty good idea, and a basic first aid course to go along with it is probably even better. Most hikers and outdoors people that I know create a bit of what they call a go bag that contains these sorts of things. It's usually small enough to be placed in a day pack or in the trunk of a car, and it goes with them whenever they get off the paved roads. If you do get lost, the best thing you can do is stay put, at least to begin with. Let the inevitable feeling of panic and confusion pass by before you make any decisions. Sitting down for that first hour is a really good idea. If you have to do something, work on building a campsite. Pitch your tarp to get some shelter from the elements. Gather some wood for a fire. Take stock of what you've got with you and go through a checklist. This will give your mind something to do and help calm it. If you're in a situation that's untenable, say due to rising floodwaters, generally try to move uphill, but do that only as either a last resort as part of a specific plan to help you get found. Data from the search and rescue databases that we mentioned earlier has generally found that there are a few strategies that are more effective in either getting unlost, as it were, or getting found. The first is heading to the top of a ridge to get a better sense of the land around you and also get a better cell phone signal if there is one. By getting up, you can often get a better sense of where you are on a map by looking for large features such as lakes or other high points on your map. This will help you triangulate your position. By the way, if you're going to attempt to use your phone, which isn't a terrible idea, the best plan is to power the phone up, use it to send a text to your contact with a short description of your condition and problem, the best estimate of your location, and the next time you'll attempt to make contact, and then power the phone back down. Don't waste the kind of power it's going to take to try to make a call and then communicate by voice with someone. This is going to drain your battery far too fast. Following this sort of a strategy can save your battery for quite a long time, especially if you can disable many of the other functions of the phone beyond communication and navigation. Including visible landmarks from your vantage point in your communications can be helpful to rescuers. Additionally, any markers or signals that you create, such as a smoky fire or a high-vis shelter, will be more visible, of course, to rescuers if done on a hilltop or a ridgeline clearing. One thing to avoid, generally, is the old advice of going downhill until you hit some sort of water and then following the water downstream. While this may work in some cases, there's no guarantee that your stream won't empty out into some flatland marsh or swamp. In fact, for a great example of this, the creek near where I live, the Potato Creek, does exactly that. It runs as a nice clear channel creek for a while, but then you get about 10 miles south of my location here, and all of a sudden it just spreads out into a lowland that's filled with marshy waters and is something that you have to then find a way to try to get around. Only seek water if you've gone a substantial period of time without it, and be sure to mark your path back to your starting point. The second method for trying to get unlost is to do something known as route sampling. In this method, a base of operations is established at a junction of some sort. Maybe it's where a game trail and a creek cross, something like that. The lost person then sets out along various routes, up the game trail, down the game trail, traveling upstream, going up a ridge line, something like that, for a given amount of time to see if the route leads to anywhere more obviously used, such as a fire road or power line. This is where the high-vis tape can really come in handy, as it allows you to move out with the confidence you'll be able to find your way back to the base of operations by following the visual breadcrumbs you placed in or around trees at eye level. If these can be left up, they can also guide a search and rescue team to your central location, thus enlarging the target area they can hit in order to find you. A related method to this is known as directional sampling, wherein you use distance landmarks to set your exploration path rather than using a route. This can result in a sort of hub and spoke pattern that can be traversed outward in increasing distances. One good trick here is to take some time to get a sense of how long it was that you last knew where you were. If you remember being on a known trail 3 hours before you realized you were lost, you know that you probably only have to travel, at most, 3 or 4 hours in some direction to find that trail again. If you're in the habit of respecting the potential danger of the endeavor you are undertaking, however, the time will probably be much less than that. And if you've periodically been checking your direction of travel by using a compass, the sun, or some other method, you'll probably be able to focus on cutting out about half of the circle of possible directions. By the way, this can be a good time to do a little map drawing of your own as a way to establish things around your surroundings. Again, please understand that these bits of advice are only a beginning and are not intended to be all-encompassing. I'm sure that some of you who are listeners will know of exceptions to these strategies and will have many more of your own to add, but hopefully you can see how such practices can, if a person can survive long enough, lead to route and survey knowledge of a region. If you're intrigued by any of this, as I said before, contact the local agency and they'll get you in touch with groups and programs that can help you learn how to do this kind of thing. As we close out this episode, a few other notes. First, if you find any of this fascinating, please do yourself a favor and go out and get John Huth's book, The Lost Art of Finding Our Way. It's really a great discussion of navigation written by someone who's done this sort of thing for a long time and is pretty good at it in a lot of different environments. We've only scratched the surface here, and he takes a really deep dive into many additional contexts. One of the things I regret having to leave out is the discussion of how Polynesian seafarers traversed incredible distances to cross the Pacific, ranging from New Zealand on one end to Hawaii on the other, out to the coast of South America, if genetic information is to be understood. Huth spends a good deal of time throughout the book talking about the means and methods they employed to get to where they were going, and that's just one example. I just really encourage everybody who just finds this kind of thing really cool to take some time to look at it. Second, look for a short supplemental episode to drop before too long about the linguistics associated with navigation and wayfinding. I've come across a wealth of really interesting information that I'd like to share with you all, if for no other reason than to allow you to bring up something out of the ordinary as you gather with friends and family and conversation. Also, if you know of any interesting resources along these lines, please don't hesitate to send me a note at cldavies@mac.com. Leave something on our Scientific Odyssey Facebook group, or drop me a mention on my Twitter account at Chad Davies. I'm also out on Instagram now, and it's Odyssey Navigator there. So if you want to find me and sort of look at some of the pictures that I like to post out there, you can certainly do that. I'll try to give you a follow back. Make sure you mention that, though, because there's a lot of weird accounts that want to follow me out on Instagram. Those of you who are out there know what I'm talking about, right? Also, there are a few thanks I'd like to give. For those of you who have sent me notes here the last few weeks or the last couple of months where I've sort of been incommunicado here, thanks. I read every one of those, and it's been super hectic, but I really appreciate the support. I'd also like to say thanks to my student, Rhett Musell, who's taken the time to look over a lot of the information here on navigation and dead reckoning and wayfinding and just sort of survival skills to make sure that I haven't stumbled too badly. Any of the mistakes in here are mine, but Rhett has done a really great job of sort of making sure I haven't gotten too far astray. Rhett, by the way, is a cadet colonel in our local Civil Air Patrol chapter here in Central Georgia. He was recently recognized by the Georgia legislature for his work in that role. He's just a fantastic, fantastic guy. Also, thanks to the folks at the Blue Dot Sessions for allowing us to use their music. It really helps to add to the atmosphere. And finally, of course, to all of you, thanks for hanging in here with me as I struggle to get episodes out. I know I say this a lot, but this semester has really proven to have been the most challenging of my 25-year-long academic career, and I found it difficult to muster the energy or creativity, to be honest, to write. Hopefully, with the coming of the summer break, I'll be able to get back on a schedule of regular releases and get information out to you in a timely fashion. So until next time, full sails on your journey.